The debate in the Senate and the punishment of the conspirators. While the Senate was transacting the business already described and was voting rewards to the Allobroges and Titus Volturcius for giving information that had been proved correct, Lentulus's freedmen and a few of his dependents were scouring the streets and trying to incite the workmen and slaves to rescue him. Some of them were also seeking the gang leaders who made a trade of organizing public disturbances. Cethegus, too, sent messages to his slaves and freedmen, a picked and trained body of men, urging them to take the bold step of forming an armed band and breaking into his place of confinement. On learning of these designs, the consul posted such guards as the emergency required, and after convoking the Senate, formally consulted it as to what should be done with the prisoners, whom in a full meeting held shortly before this, it had already pronounced to be guilty of treasonable conduct. Decimus Junius Silanus was called on to speak first because he was consul-elect. He proposed that the conspirators already in custody, and also Lucius Cassius, Publius Furius, Publius Umbrenus, and Quintus Annius, if they were apprehended, should be executed. Later in the debate, Silanus was so much impressed by Caesar's speech that he said he would vote for the proposal of Tiberius Nero, which was that the matter should be adjourned to a later meeting, and the guards strengthened in the meantime. Caesar, when his turn came to be called on by the consul, spoke to the following effect: "Whoever, gentlemen, is deliberating upon a difficult question ought to clear his mind of hatred and affection, and of anger and compassion. It is not easy to discern the truth when one's view is obstructed by such emotions, and all experience proves that those who yield to passion never make politic decisions. If you concentrate your mind on a problem, it can exert its full powers. Once let passion come in, it will take control of you and reduce your mind to impotence. There are plenty of examples that I could cite of kings and peoples who have allowed anger or pity to lead them into error, but I would rather mention some cases in which our own ancestors, by controlling their emotions, acted wisely and properly. In the war which Rome fought against King Perseus of Macedon, the powerful and wealthy state of Rhodes, which our support had made what it was, proved disloyal and turned against us. At the end of the war, when the matter came up for discussion, the Romans feared that if they annexed the island, it might be said that they had gone to war to enrich themselves rather than to punish King Perseus for his wrongful conduct. So they let the Rhodians go unpunished. Similarly, in the whole series of wars with Carthage, in spite of many outrages committed by the Carthaginians in time of peace or during a truce, they never retaliated in kind, even when they had the chance. Such conduct they regarded as unworthy of Romans, even if it might be justifiable as a reprisal. You also, gentlemen, must take care that the guilt of Publius Lentulus and the others does not outweigh your sense of what is fitting, and that you do not indulge your resentment at the expense of your reputation. If a punishment can be found that is really adequate to their crimes, I am willing to support a departure from precedent. But if the enormity of their wickedness is such that no one could devise a fitting penalty, then I think we should content ourselves with those provided by the laws. Most of the previous speakers have delivered elaborate and impressive speeches in which they deplored the miserable condition of our country. They have dwelt upon the horrors of war and the fate that awaits the vanquished. how girls and boys are ravished, children torn from their parents' arms, wives subjected to the lusts of conquerors, temples and homes pillaged. How amid fire and slaughter, with weapons, corpses, and blood on every side, a cry of universal mourning goes up. But what in God's name was the purpose of all this eloquence? Was it to make you detest the conspiracy? As if a man, whom the grisly reality has failed to move, could be roused by an eloquent speech. That can never be. No mortal man minimizes his own wrongs. Many, indeed, resent them more than they ought. But not everyone, gentlemen, is equally free to show his resentment. If humble men, who pass their lives in obscurity, are provoked by anger to do wrong, few know of it, because few know anything about such unimportant people. But men in positions of great power live, as it were, on an eminence, and their actions are known to all the world. The higher our station, the less is our freedom of action. We must avoid partiality and hatred, and above all anger, for what in others would be called merely an outburst of temper, in those who bear rule is called arrogance and cruelty. For my own part, gentlemen, I think that any torture would be less than these men's crimes deserve. But most people remember only what happens last. When criminals are brought to justice, they forget their guilt and talk only of their punishment, if it is of unusual severity. I am sure that Decimus Silanus spoke on this serious matter with the best interests of his country at heart, and not from a desire to please anyone or to gratify feelings of personal enmity. For I know him as both a gallant patriot and a man of wise discretion. Yet his proposal strikes me, I will not say, as harsh, for in dealing with such men, nothing could properly be described as harsh, but as out of keeping with the traditions of our republic. Surely, Silanus, it must have been either fear or a sense of outrage that impelled you, a consul-elect, to suggest a form of punishment that is without precedent. Fear can be left out of the question, especially as, thanks to the precautions taken by our distinguished consul, we have such strong guards under arms. As regards the penalty you proposed, it would be relevant to observe that to men in grief and wretchedness death comes as a release from suffering, not as a punishment to be endured, because it puts an end to all the ills that flesh is heir to, and beyond it there is no place for either tears or rejoicing. But what I want to ask is, why in heaven's name did you not also propose that the prisoners should be flogged before being executed? Was it because the Porcian law forbids it? But there are other laws which provide that convicted citizens shall not be put to death, but shall be permitted to go into exile. Was it then because flogging is a severer punishment than death? But what penalty can be regarded as harsh or excessive for men found guilty of such a crime? If, however, it was because you thought flogging a lighter punishment, how can it be logical to respect the law in a comparatively small matter when you have disregarded it in a more important point? It may be asked, who will take exception to any sentence that is passed upon traitors? The lapse of time and the caprice of fortune, which controls the destinies of all men, will one day produce a change of feeling. These particular men will have richly deserved whatever happens to them. But you, gentlemen, must consider the precedent that you establish for others. All bad precedents originate from measures good in themselves. When power passes into the hands of ignorant or unworthy men, the precedent which you establish by inflicting an extraordinary penalty on guilty men who deserve it will be used against innocent men who do not deserve it. The Spartans, for example, set up in Athens, when they had conquered it, an oligarchy of 30 members. These men began by executing without trial notorious malefactors whom everyone loathed, and the people rejoiced and said it was well done. After a time, they began to act more and more irresponsibly, killing good and bad alike as the whim took them, and intimidating all the rest. Thus Athens was oppressed and enslaved, and paid a heavy price for its foolish rejoicing. In our own times, when the victorious Sulla ordered the execution of Damasippus and other adventurers whom national calamities had raised to high positions, who did not approve his action? The men were criminals and troublemakers, whose revolutionary intrigues had harassed the state, and it was agreed that they deserved to die. But those executions were the first step that led to a ghastly calamity. For before long, if anyone coveted a man's mansion or villa, or in the end, merely his household plate or wearing apparel, he found means to have him put on the list of proscribed persons. So those who rejoiced at the death of Damasippus were soon haled off to execution themselves, and the killing did not stop till Sulla had glutted all his followers with riches. I am not afraid that any such action will be taken by Cicero or in this present age. But in a great nation like ours, there are many men with many different characters. It may be that on some future occasion, when another consul has, like him, an armed force at his disposal, some false report will be accepted as true. And when, with this precedent before him, a consul draws the sword in obedience to a senatorial decree, who will there be to restrain him or to stay his hand? Our ancestors, gentlemen, never lacked wisdom or courage, and they were never too proud to take over a sound institution from another country. They borrowed most of their armor and weapons from the Samnites, and most of their magisterial insignia from the Etruscans. In short, if they thought anything that an ally or an enemy had was likely to suit them, they enthusiastically adopted it at Rome, for they would rather copy a good thing than be consumed with envy because they had not got it. In this period of imitation, they followed the Greek custom of flogging citizens and executing convicted criminals. However, with the growth of the state and the development of party strife resulting from the increase of population, innocent people were victimized, and other similar abuses grew up. To check them, the Porcian law was enacted, and other laws which allowed condemned persons the alternative of going into exile. This seems to me, gentlemen, a particularly strong argument against our making any innovation, for I cannot but think that there was greater virtue and wisdom in our predecessors, who with such small resources created such a vast empire, than there is in us, who find it as much as we can do to keep what they so nobly won. Am I suggesting, you will ask, that the prisoners be released to go and swell Catiline's army? By no means. My advice is that their goods be confiscated, and that they be imprisoned in such towns as are best provided to undertake their custody. Further, that their case shall not thereafter be debated in the Senate, or brought before a public assembly. If anyone contravenes this prohibition, the Senate should, I suggest, register its opinion that his action will be treasonable and contrary to the public interest. After Caesar's speech, most of the other senators contented themselves with a formal expression of agreement with one proposal or the other. But Marcus Porcius Cato, when asked his opinion, spoke to the following effect: "When I in turn, gentlemen, from contemplating the dangerous situation in which we stand to reflect upon the opinions of some of the previous speakers, the impression made on my mind is very different. If I understand them rightly, they were discussing the punishment to be meted out to these men who have planned to make war on their country, parents, altars, and hearths. But the situation warns us rather to take precautions against them than to deliberate what sentence we shall pass on them. Other crimes can be punished when they have been committed, but with a crime like this, unless you take measures to prevent its being committed, it is too late. Once it has been done, it is useless to invoke the law. When a city is captured, its defeated inhabitants lose everything. I will address myself for a moment to those of you who have always been more concerned for your houses, villas, statues, and pictures than you have for your country. In heaven's name, men, if you want to keep those cherished possessions, whatever they may be, if you want to have peace and quiet for the enjoyment of your pleasures, wake up while there is still time and lend a hand to defend the Republic. It is not a matter of misappropriated taxes or wrongs done to subject peoples. It is our liberty and lives that are at stake. Many a time, gentlemen, have I spoken at length in this house. Many a time have I reproached our fellow citizens for their self-indulgence and greed, and by so doing have made many enemies. For as I had never in my own conscience excused myself for any wrongdoing, I found it hard to pardon the sins which other men's passions led them to commit. You took little notice of my remonstrances, but the stability of the state was not impaired by your indifference, because of its great prosperity. Now, however, it is not the question of whether our morals are good or bad, nor is it the size and grandeur of the Roman Empire that we have to consider. The issue is whether that empire, whatever we may think of it, is going to remain ours, or whether we and it together are to fall into the hands of enemies. In such a crisis, does anyone talk to me of clemency and compassion? For a long time now, we have ceased to call things by their proper names. To give away other people's property is called generosity. Criminal daring goes by the name of courage. That is why our affairs have come to such a pass. However, since such is our standard of morality, let Romans be liberal if they want to, at the expense of our subjects. Let them be merciful to plunderers of the exchequer. But let them not make a present of our lifeblood, and by sparing a handful of criminals, go the way to destroy all honest men. It was an eloquent and polished lecture that Gaius Caesar delivered to you a few minutes ago on the subject of life and death. Evidently, he disbelieves the account men give of the next world, how the wicked go a different way from the good, and inhabit a place of horror, fear, and noisome desolation. Therefore, he recommended that the property of the accused should be confiscated, and that they should be imprisoned in various towns. No doubt he feared that if they remained in Rome, either the adherents of the conspiracy or a hired mob might rescue them by force. What does he think? Are there bad characters and criminals only at Rome, and not all over Italy? Is reckless violence not more likely to succeed where there is less strength to resist it? His proposals are useless if he apprehends danger from the conspirators, and if amid such universal fear he alone is not afraid, I have the more reason to be afraid for myself and for you. In making your decision about Publius Lentulus and the other prisoners, you must realize that you will also be determining the fate of Catiline's army and of the whole body of conspirators. The more energetically you act, the more will their courage be shaken. Show the slightest weakness, and you will soon have the whole pack of them here barking defiance at you. Do not imagine that it was by force of arms that our ancestors transformed a petty state into this great republic. If it were so, it would now be at the height of its glory, since we have more subjects and citizens, more arms and horses than they had. It was something quite different that made them great, something that we are entirely lacking in. They were hard workers at home, just rulers abroad, and to the council chamber they brought untrammeled minds, neither racked by consciousness of guilt nor enslaved by passion. We have lost these virtues. We pile up riches for ourselves while the state is bankrupt. We sing the praises of prosperity and idle away our lives. Good men or bad, it is all one. All the prizes that merit ought to win are carried off by ambitious intriguers. And no wonder when each one of you schemes only for himself, when in your private lives you are slaves to pleasure, and here in the Senate House, the tools of money or influence. The result is that when an assault is made upon the Republic, there is no one there to defend it. I will say no more on that subject. A plot has been hatched by citizens of the highest rank to set fire to their native city. Gauls, the deadliest foes of everything Roman, have been called to arms. The hostile army and its leader are ready to descend upon us. And are you still hesitating and unable to decide how to treat public enemies taken within your walls? I suggest you take pity on them. They are young men led astray by ambition. Armed though they are, let them go. But mind what you are doing with your clemency and compassion. If they unsheathe the sword, you may have reason to regret your attitude. Oh yes, you say, the situation is certainly ugly, but you are not afraid of it. On the contrary, you are shaking in your shoes. But you are so indolent and weak that you stand irresolute, each waiting for someone else to act, trusting doubtless to the gods, who have often preserved our republic in times of deadly peril. I tell you that vows and womanish supplications will not secure divine aid. It is by vigilance, action, and wise counsel that all success is achieved. If you give way to sloth and cowardice, the gods turn a deaf ear to your entreaties. Their wrath makes them your enemies. In bygone days, during a war with the Gauls, Aulus Manlius Torquatus had his son put to death for fighting the enemy against orders. That noble youth paid with his life for an excess of valor. And do you, who are trying a set of ruthless traitors to their country, hesitate about the appropriate sentence to pass? If their lives are urged in extenuation of their crime, by their past lives let them be judged. Spare Lentulus for his high rank, if he ever spared his own, chastity, and good name, or showed any respect for God or man. Pardon the youth Sergius, if this is not already the second time he has made war on his country. As for Gabinius, Statilius, and Caeparius, if they had not been utterly unscrupulous, they would never have plotted as they did against the state. To conclude, gentlemen, if we could afford to risk the consequences of making a mistake, I should be quite willing to let experience convince you of your folly, since you scorn advice. But we are completely encircled. Catiline and his army are ready to grip us by the throat, and there are other foes within the walls in the very heart of our city. We can make no plans or preparations without its being known, an additional reason for acting quickly. This, therefore, is my recommendation. Whereas, by the criminal designs of wicked citizens, the Republic has been subjected to serious danger, and whereas, by the testimony of Titus, Volturcius, and the envoys of the Allobroges, confirmed by the prisoner's own confession, they stand convicted of having planned massacre, arson, and other foul atrocities against their fellow citizens and their country, that having admitted their criminal intention, they should be put to death, as if they had been caught in the actual commission of capital offenses, in accordance with ancient custom. When Cato sat down, all the senators of consular rank and a large number of others expressed approval of his proposal, and praised his courage to the skies, reproaching one another for their faint-heartedness. Cato was now regarded as a great and illustrious citizen, and a decree of the Senate was passed in the terms of his resolution. Reading and hearing much of the glorious exploits of the Roman people, in peace and war, on land and sea, I was attracted by the problem of discovering what particular qualities enabled them to carry through such great undertakings. I knew that on many occasions they had only small forces to pit against huge enemy armies, and slender resources with which to do battle against rich and powerful kings. That fortune had often dealt them cruel blows, and that just as the Greeks were superior to them in eloquence, so the Gauls had formerly outstripped them in martial prowess. After much thought, I reached the conclusion that the preeminent merit of a few citizens had made all these achievements possible, enabling poor men to conquer rich, a handful to subdue a multitude. But in a later period, when Rome was demoralized by luxury and idleness, the position was reversed. It was now its own greatness that saved the Republic from being ruined by the failings of its generals and magistrates. For many years, as if the vigor of earlier generations were exhausted, there was not one man in Rome of conspicuous merit. In my own time, however, there have been two men of striking worth, though of very different characters: Marcus Cato and Gaius Caesar. Since my subject has brought them to my notice, I do not intend to pass them by in silence, but will give the best description I can of their respective gifts and characters. In birth, age, and eloquence they were well matched. They had the same nobility of soul, and equal though quite different reputations. Caesar was esteemed for the many kind services he rendered and for his lavish generosity. Cato for the consistent uprightness of his life. The former was renowned for his humanity and mercy. The latter had earned respect by his strict austerity. Caesar won fame by his readiness to give, to relieve, to pardon. Cato by never offering presents. The one was a refuge for the unfortunate, and was praised for his good nature. The other was a scourge for the wicked, admired for his firmness. Finally, Caesar had made it a rule to work hard and sleep little, to devote himself to the interests of his friends and to neglect his own, to be ready to give people anything that was worth the giving. For himself, he wanted a high command, an army, and a war in some new field where his gifts could shine in all their brightness. Cato's taste was for restraint, propriety, and above all austerity. He did not compete in wealth with the wealthy or in party quarrels with the politicians, but with the man of action, in deserving, with the virtuous in self-restraint, and with the righteous in strict honesty. He was more concerned to be a good man than to be thought one, and so, the less he courted fame, the more did it attend his steps unsought. When the Senate had adopted Cato's recommendation, the consul thought it best not to wait for nightfall, in case some fresh attempt might be made in the interval, and he therefore directed the triumvirs to make the necessary preparations for the executions. Posting guards at various points, he personally conducted Lentulus to the prison, while the praetors brought the other prisoners. In the prison is a chamber, called the Tullianum, which one reaches after a short ascent to the left. It is about 12 feet below ground, enclosed all round by walls and roofed by a vault of stone. Its filthy condition, darkness, and foul smell give it a loathsome and terrifying air. After Lentulus had been lowered into this chamber, the executioners carried out their orders and strangled him with a noose. So did this patrician, descended from the illustrious family of the Cornelii, a man who had held consular authority at Rome, meet an end worthy of his character and conduct. Cethegus, Statilius, Gabinius, and Caeparius suffered the same punishment.